Hello and welcome to Penguin Classics On Air. This is Elda Rotor, editorial director of Penguin Classics. Groucho Marx once said, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." For today's program, Penguin's associate publisher and editor-in-chief, Stephen Morrison, talks with New York Times bestselling authors Thomas Cathcart and Daniel Klein about the classic works of four major philosophers, Plato, Descartes, Berkeley, and Kierkegaard.
I'm here today with Daniel Klein and Thomas Cathcart, the authors of the best-selling Plato and a Platypus Walk into a Bar, Understanding Philosophy Through Jokes, and the upcoming Heidegger and a Hippo Walk Through Those Pearly Gates, using philosophy and jokes to explore life, death, the afterlife, and everything in between, which will be available in October wherever books are sold. Now, Danny and Tom met more than 50 years ago as undergrads at Harvard, where they both majored in philosophy. They've been debating philosophers and their philosophies ever since. For today's show, we posed a challenge to them to name the four philosophers you must read before you die.
Hi, this is Danny Klein, and I want to ask Tom, since we've chosen Plato as our lead-off philosopher to read before you die, or possibly while you're dying. Alfred North Whitehead famously said that after Plato, everything in philosophy were simply footnotes to him. What did he mean by that?
Right. I think he probably meant that Plato sort of set the agenda for all the future Western philosophy. You know, he raised the questions that philosophers have dealt with ever since. Questions of metaphysics, like what's the nature of reality? You know, questions about ethics, who is the just man? What counts as justice? Even issues of logic that we ordinarily associate more with Aristotle than Plato. But Plato also raised questions of how you make a reasonable argument. Aesthetics, you know, what is the nature of the beautiful?
So it's probably more the questions that he raised than the answers that he gave.
Yeah, partly yes, but partly also he gave such cogent arguments for his point of view that a lot of philosophy has been either agreeing with him and presenting further arguments or taking him on.
Yeah. Wasn't it the philosophy professor Robert Wolff who said that Aristotle probably would have been the one that everybody said everything following him was a footnote to him, but he wrote too long.
Right. Plato wrote short dialogues.
Plato was more elliptical, and the dialogue. I think the dialogue form that Plato introduced to philosophy is something that's lasted, dialectical philosophy, taking an argument and then the counter-argument.
Exactly.
That's what I plan to do with you today, Tom.
Ooh.
In The Republic, the book in the Penguin Classics that we particularly want to point to, Plato revisits the idea of the forms. What is that?
By forms, Plato sort of meant what we mean by ideals. And not just ethical ideals or religious ideals, but he thought that everything participated in an ideal type. For example, he thought that actual triangles are never quite the perfect triangle, but they're trying to be. And so Euclid's geometry doesn't work about real triangles because they're always a little millimeter off. Euclid's arguments about geometry only work in an ideal world, with an ideal triangle that's a perfect triangle. And so Plato thought that trees, actual trees, were only copies of an ideal tree.
What do you say about trees, that any individual tree is just participating in treeness?
Yeah, that's the word he used, participating. That's the relationship between actual things and the ideals, is the actual things participate in the ideal.
My reading of Plato is he thinks that these ideals really exist, yet not in time and space.
Right.
So what the heck is that?
Well, the sort of glib answer that you learn in Philosophy 101 is that they're in, quote, Plato's heaven. But what he really meant is that they don't exist. Exist wouldn't be quite the right word, because actual things exist. They're more real than existing things. They exist in a hyper-reality. And where is that? It isn't anywhere.
Yeah, but he seems to hint that it's somewhere, like in the allegory of the cave, where he says all we can see is the shadows on the wall. That is the participants in these ideals. But beyond the cave, oh boy, it's loaded with ideals.
He thinks philosophers can somehow get in touch with these. That's why his philosopher is the king. philosophers are the kingly class in the Republic.
Okay, yeah, let's go to that now, because the Republic primarily is about the ideal state, how to set it up, or how it should be set up, let's say. And he's anti-democracy, is he not?
Very much so, yeah. His Republic is on the 20th century philosopher Karl Popper's list of what he called closed societies, because everything is rigged in this society.
Sounds awfully elitist to me.
Very much so.
By a 21st century sensibility, not real attractive. Although didn't Plato say that the only reason anybody would want to be a philosopher king is because he wouldn't want to be ruled by his inferiors? That's the alternative.
That's right.
That's sort of the ultimate elitist statement. But sometimes when I listen to talk radio, I think, yeah, I don't want to be ruled by them. So I kind of get it. Okay, just a final thing about the Republic, and that is, why do you think it's important to read, especially while you're lying in your deathbed?
Well, one reason I think it's important is the point that you raised, is that philosophy since really is footnotes to Plato. But another reason is that Greek classical idea of harmony and ideals and formal beauty still ripples through Western culture. You know, think of classical music in the narrow sense, meaning Haydn and Mozart and the late 18th century composers. That's a strand still in Western aesthetics of the formal, the stately, the well-balanced, as opposed to the romantic and, the wild music of the 19th century. So forth.
Rap music.
Rap music. Yeah, that's still a strand in our aesthetic sense today.